Good morning, everyone. Welcome, welcome. I'm just going to give it a couple of minutes while people are joining in. Thank you for being here. Good morning, good afternoon, good night from wherever you are joining. Okay, so I think we can start now. Good morning, good evening, everyone. I'm thrilled to welcome you to the second version of this international webinar series around the GCF Watch. My name is Florencio Ortúzar. I work for the Inter-American Association for Environmental Defense, AIDA. This is a Latin American NGO that uses the law and the science to protect the environment in our region. I want to first begin by thanking our interpreters. I'm going to explain quickly how interpretation works. Today we have interpretation in Spanish, French, and Portuguese. So for you that haven't used this in Zoom, what you have to do is to press the little world icon that you can see below your screen and choose your interpretation language. It's better if you don't change the language very much because it can mess up. So it's better if you sort of stick to one language. For the panelists, which I'm going to thank in a second, I want to ask you to please speak slowly so that the interpreters can really gather the important information you'll be sharing. And if you go too fast, I'm going to sound this bell to let you know that you should please slow down. So, following with a huge thank you to all our panelists who will share their knowledge with us during these 3 sessions we will hold. This is a series of webinars, which are 3 of them, 1 per month. So today, the 1st of June is the first one. There's one in July and then one in August. And I would also like to give a very, very warm thank you to all the people and representatives of organizations that have helped with the planning of this event. You can see the logos of all these organizations in the invitation of the webinar. And I want to give a special thank you to Berta Argueta from German Watch and Claire Miranda from the Asians People Movement from Depth and Development, with whom we laid the first ideas of this second session, of this second version of the GCF Web International Webinar. And now for those of you who don't know what the GCF Watch is, the GCF Watch is an information platform on the Green Climate Fund. It's available online. It's led by organizations of the South, and it seeks to promote participation of Southern civil society with the GCF. It seeks also to provide better systematization of all the types of information related to the fund and the way we work around it, so that civil society can better monitor projects and programs that are approved by the fund, its politics, and everything that has to do with the GCF. So today, which is the first session of our international webinar series, Cairos De La Cruz will give a presentation on the GCF Watch so you can have better understanding of it and the opportunities it offers. So that will come in a minute. So I also want to mention that the GCF Watch participates within a larger civil society organization network, which is known as the GCF CSO network, which is a conglomeration of all organizations worldwide working around the GCF to make the GCF accountable, to push for the correct implementation of its policies, and for it to comply effectively with its very important mission, which is to provide much needed climate resources to alleviate climate change in the countries that need this help desperately. And as a personal note, I've always appreciated the way this network of organizations works. It's very open to any organization that wants to participate in it. And in spite of its very ample geographic distribution, because you have organizations from all over the world contributing, which is obviously a big challenge, collaboration works very smoothly. I think it's a very good example of international collaboration towards a common goal. So with this, the work of the GCF CSO network and the incredible efforts of all the organizations that participate there, we have been able to come to the board with key information that comes from civil society and from communities. And all this information is present in the decisions of the board, thanks to all this work done by these very committed and team-driven people. So this obviously has everything to do with the important work that is done in spaces such as this one. It's all about providing a bridge between financial institutions which move the money and the communities that might benefit from that money or that sadly might be affected by that money. But supposedly this money is there to help climate change in this case. So this wouldn't be possible if we wouldn't have this level of interest and engagement from the organizations that work, from you, the audiences that come to this kind of event, which are willing to join forces to build capacity together and provide with their own experiences and expertise to this very important effort, which is to monitor climate finance. And in this event, particularly the Green Climate Fund. So thank you very much for being here and for following up and from supporting the work we all do together. So climate finance, it can be a bit tiring because, as I was saying, in spite of the fact that it has very noble stated purposes, which is to move the money to solve the climate crisis, it many times ends up pushing for projects that cause more harm than benefit, than good in local communities and in the environment. So this is maybe the main reason why civil society has so much work, and so that is so important that we keep on monitoring and that we don't put our attention down. And the GCF obviously is no exception. The mandate it has to help countries reduce their greenhouse gas emissions and increase their ability to respond to climate change is vital. And it is also the largest international fund dedicated to dealing with climate change. So in this sense, it has a very important role in complying with the Paris Agreement and in keeping temperatures below what is safe for humanity and for life in our planet. So developed countries, as you all know probably, have pledged to pay for developing countries to help them transition to low carbon economies and to adapt to the worst impacts of this changing climate. And the GCF is none less than one of the main channels to move these resources, to make those pledges real. So it is very important that we remain alert, up to date with what is going on in the fund, and that we join forces so that these precious resources that are there to fight climate change are used in the best way possible. So we decided on making this event international with the difference, the problem that comes with that because of the time differences, etc. Because the GCF Watch and the work we do around the GCF as organizations that come together owes a lot of its great potential to the fact that it allows the joining of efforts throughout the different regions. So today we have an incredible opportunity to connect with people from all over the world that are working towards this end, towards providing good climate finance that really helps us get out of this mess. We have people from all over the world, including the 3 regional nodes represented in the GCF Watch, which are the regions of the GCF Watch, which are Africa, Asia, and Latin America. So today's session will begin with a tour of the GCF Watch Platform by Cairos De La Cruz, and then Erika Lenon, which is the active observer to the GCF as the civil society observer to the GCF, will tell us about the last 2 board meetings and a bit of reflection on the topics that civil society organizations are working on these days. After that, we will have a survey that we have prepared so that all of you, the people that are watching here, can let us know which topics around the GCF you would like to see covered in our third session, which is in August, and for which there is still no agenda. So this is going to be a very interesting experiment that we are looking forward. So be prepared at the end of the presentations to vote on the topic that you would prefer to see covered on our third session. And then after that, we will also have space for interaction, for questions and conversations with the panelists. So you can start writing your questions in the chat or in the questions and answers boxes as soon as they come to you. And just to finish, our next sessions are going to be on the 7th of July, so more or less in a month from today. And then we will talk about the implementation of projects approved by the GCF. And this is because we thought about this topic because historically, civil society organizations around the GCF have been very focused on the projects that are being proposed and approved, because the fund is not so old. So this obviously was the first thing we had to look into. But now it is already important to start looking into what has already been approved and is being implemented. So that session will be about implementation. We will include case studies going on in different regions where projects are being implemented. We will include information on the IRM, which is the redress mechanism of the GCF, where communities can go when a project is causing harm. And there will also be reflection on the implementation of gender action plans within the projects that are under implementation. And then on the third session, as I had said, which is on August the 3rd, we will cover the topics that the survey identifies as the most interesting for the public. So for the registration you did for this session, you have already registered to the 3 sessions. So we look forward to seeing you. With this, I pass the microphone to our first panelist, Cairos De La Cruz. It is a pleasure to greet you, Cairos. Cairos is the head of the climate finance team at the Institute for Climate and Sustainable Cities, which is based in Philippines. So the microphone is all yours, Cairos.
Hi, good evening, everyone. I am from the Philippines, but I'm in Bali right now for a workshop on climate and disaster risk finance. But I'm happy to be here, and I'm super glad that this is happening again. I mean, we had the same session a year ago, and I think, you know, information and having access to information and the responsibility to share it to a broader network will never finish. It's an ongoing process, and I'm very glad to have this opportunity to walk you through GCF Watch. Let me share my screen. Yeah. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. So my presentation is basically GCF Watch 101, what it is and how does it work. But before that, let me introduce myself again. I'm Angelo Cairos De La Cruz. I work for the Institute for Climate and Sustainable Cities, or ICSC. ICSC is one of sort of the founding members of GCF Watch. It was founded many, many years ago by a small group of civil society organizations who remain to be committed, I'm proud to say, who remain to be committed to the cause of making sure that GCF is accountable up to this day. When you go, when you search for GCF Watch, make sure you click gcfwatch.org. You'll see something like this. So from this slide, it's quite obvious that GCF Watch, well, it's just a website, but it's unique because apart from being just an online platform, it is powered by something really unique, which is the people behind it, the learnings from the ground, the ideas that keeps on percolating, especially from the local and grassroots level. So GCF Watch was founded simply because the Green Climate Fund portfolio is growing. It has been growing in the past few years in terms of funding mobilized, funding disbursed, projects received, challenges, opportunities, and many other things. The years of being operational would, logically would translate to more experiences that has to be captured, and that would also translate to more voices possibly being marginalized throughout the implementation. GCF Watch seeks to set a rebalancing act to make sure that the voices from the ground would be able to reach not only the national level, but even more so the international space in terms of policy discussions and implementation. Civil society observers of the GCF represent a quite deep, a huge knowledge base that is responsible for groundbreaking work and grassroots mobilization. Some of the pillars when you search for the Green Climate Fund, when you try to research on, policy level academic pieces on GCF, you'll definitely see civil society organizations, civil society personalities doing this work for a very long time. However, despite that, a huge, we think that it's just the tip of the iceberg. We feel like a lot of content materials, a lot of stories remain to be tapped into. It has to be curated to a broader audience. So GCF Watch, by definition, is simply a Southern-led initiative established to promote and facilitate engagement and accelerate the readiness of Southern civil society organizations, indigenous peoples, and local communities to engage with the GCF. It has an evolving mandate. We keep on saying that GCF Watch is made by CSOs for CSOs. But a deeper look into the website's metadata and feedback, we know that it's being used beyond the CSO sector. It's also being used at times even by the GCF Secretariat to gather some of the stories from the ground, or to get the massive amount of civil society generated comments and interventions during meetings. And we are looking forward to sort of further expand that to include, to monitor how people are taking in, for example, stories of projects being implemented, say in Central Asia or in Southeast Asia and many other places. GCF Watch seeks to become a platform of elevating local concerns to the levels of formulation, consultation, planning, implementation, and even evaluation. GCF Watch seeks to go beyond the numbers that we know. The GCF Secretariat is quite good in presenting the numbers, but we want to go beyond that and actually look at, how these numbers, how financing a certain project is actually impacting societies, or whether it's actually beneficial, as mentioned by Florencia a while ago, whether this financing is actually helping those who are already vulnerable and not making their situation even worse. GCF Watch technically is open for all in terms of contribution, in terms of suggesting topics that it has to focus on during board meetings and in between board meetings. But GCF Watch is led by a steering committee and an advisory council. The steering committee is pretty much the regional nodes representing Asia, Africa, and Latin America. At least that's a current scope right now. And some of the enabling members, active observers such as my co-panelist Erica, and some of the conveners, including ICSC. ICSC is more or less in charge of the technical side of things. So we receive most of the stories, we upload them, we try to communicate them as far as we can. But the other members are responsible for identifying the priorities, the focus of the platform whenever needed. The steering committee is the highest governing body of the initiative. It's the decision-making body of the initiative, just in case we have to make decisions on various things, like the design of the website, the direction given, varying contexts, such as the focus area of a specific board meeting, and so on. The steering committee is also responsible in ensuring that the achievement of objectives and sustainability of the initiative is always on everyone's memory note. The advisory council, those are members that are invited to join GCF Watch to support the steering committee. The advisory council is by design, it's meant to be, a larger group of individuals representing varying organizations. And the advisory council also works in a way, it's a checks and it's also a check and balance. It's also a check and balance instrument. Just to make sure that the steering committee is actually bringing the GCF Watch to the direction that the rest of the civil society wants it to go. In terms of principles, GCF Watch, the steering committee, the advisory council, some of its members, we simply function with a particular focus on trust. We trust each other in such a way that we know that no information, no data, no story will be put forward for posting in the GCF Watch which are false or not true. We know that people are vetting whatever they want to put in the website. We know that the interventions being posted are precisely the same interventions being mentioned during board meetings, and so on. We are also a very small group. GCF Watch is a loose organization at some extent, so the nature of working together is really quite dynamic. Just like many other networks, GCF Watch also has its own challenges, especially in ensuring that members would actually participate, that members would actually contribute, that the stories from the ground are actually being facilitated by the regional nodes, and so on. But those things, I believe, given the high level of trust and confidence that we have with each other, those things are usually very minor compared to the bigger things that we want to achieve. Prioritization or at the local level is always at the front and center of all discussions. One of the things GCF Watch want to do is to provide more evidence in terms of GCF's implementation and approaches and policy and effects of its policies. GCF Watch wants to take part in ground truthing, whether GCF Watch is actually benefiting people on the ground, that it's not enabling, it's not enabling activities that might be detrimental, for example, to a particular indigenous people's community or in a particular sector of society, and so on. So local level stories, local level interests would always be a priority of GCF Watch. In terms of the logical flow on how does it work, it's quite straightforward. First, it's about sharing content. Organizations beyond the steering committee and beyond the advisory council, literally any organization can share content materials as long as it follows basic guidelines. We will just say, there's a vetting process as well that are supposed to be identified by the regional nodes to make sure that whatever information that we share are precise and are correct. And then we also do content curation. The steering committee and the advisory council members will try to manage as much as they can how content is being posted, how content is being presented to the bigger public, how content materials are posted in terms of timing, in terms of building up a campaign, for example. So those two usually comes hand in hand. Sharing content generation, sharing it and curating it, making sure that we get enough interest to make sure that it lands on the screen of our target audience. GCF Watch can also be a platform to call for action. And this is quite, we haven't had a chance to, go big on this, but GCF Watch can also house like small campaigns that organizations feel like are necessary towards the Green Climate Fund or towards a specific board meeting or a specific board meeting agenda item, and so on. So as I've said, the working nature of GCF Watch is quite dynamic, but this pretty much sums, I mean, how it goes usually. So contributing to GCF Watch is, again, it's a straightforward process. It has to be refined even further, but for now, it is, I mean, just in case you have like content materials that you're ready to share, these are the steps that you can do. First, just share the content that you have. These are some of the regional nodes email addresses that we can use. We also have a general GCF Watch email address, which is info@gcfwatch.org. Sending your content would have to follow a guidelines, especially if you want some multimedia materials in the website. And I'm talking about photos, galleries, videos, animation, and so on. And then we'll definitely notify you. I mean, what's the status of the content that you share? And if in case we post it, what's the reach? What's the metadata around that? So we're using a simple, we're using Google Analytics to monitor posting and so on, so that we can also advise you in terms of how to further grow the interest around the content materials that you are generating. Yeah, and if you have any questions, I'll be more than happy to answer. I mean, I'll be here until the end of the webinar. But that's how the general workings of GCF Watch. Yeah, and I'll be more than happy, and I look forward to receiving content materials and your stories after the webinar and in the years to come. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cairos. That was a very useful presentation. It is in the end, these types of tools work and function and do what they do thanks to the participation of everyone. So the invitation is to use it, to upload information, to propose. Actually, the first webinar series, all the recordings are available in the GCF Watch webpage, so you can revisit them, and this one will be available as well, obviously. So now we're going to go to Erika Lenon. She's the senior attorney in the Climate and Energy Program at CIEL, which is the Center for International Environmental Law. And she also currently serves as the civil society active observer from the developed country constituency at the Green Climate Fund. So Erika is going to share some of her very, very valuable experience with us. Thank you, Erika.
Thanks, Florencia, and everyone, and Cairos and Bertha, and everyone who's been involved in organizing these webinars. It's always great to be part of the GCF Watch webinar series. So, as Florencia mentioned, I'm one of the 2 current active observers for civil society organizations. At the GCF, there's one from developed and one from developing countries. But I think, as is evidenced in what Florencia has laid out and what Cairos has laid out, we really work collectively across constituencies as one big network of civil society organizations, indigenous peoples groups, local communities, globally from both, the global north, global south, developed, developing, to engage with and monitor and to try and make sure that the GCF is delivering on its promises and providing the climate finance needed, and in a way that's compatible with community needs and human rights, and that really respects human rights and the environment. So I'm going to try and reflect a bit on what's been happening at the GCF recently, and to provide a bit of a look forward for what's coming up this year, that collectively as sort of civil society we are looking towards, and where we can hopefully make some progress and some gains. So far this year, the GCF has had 2 board meetings. So the way that both the 31st and the 32nd board meeting, and the way that they're often reflected is by calling them, B32 is the 32nd board meeting. So if I use B32 as an acronym, that's apologies for the acronyms I may use in advance of using them, but that's the most recent board meeting, which took place 2 weeks ago. And then there was another board meeting earlier this year at the end of March. So I'm going to reflect back a bit on what has happened at those meetings and then look forward. So I'll first sort of start from the premise of, so this last board meeting that we had, B32, which happened 2 weeks ago in Antigua, which is a small island in the Caribbean, is the first time the GCF has actually met in person since March of 2020. And so it's been the first board meeting that hasn't been held on Zoom or in a virtual setting, which made it a bit different than what we've had in the recent past, both because the meetings were able to go for a longer period of time. So they were a full day because the board members were in the same time zone. This presented considerable challenges because in deciding where the meeting was and having the meeting, they didn't have enough space to have the normal number of civil society organizations, the normal number of accredited entities, or anyone present at the meeting, which is a challenge and something that collectively we as civil society groups pushed back against, because you can't have one of these meetings without allowing for participation of civil society, and just allowing for the participation of the active observers is not really enough. But it was the first in-person meeting that has happened, which ended up being a slightly more productive meeting, and whether that's a function of being in person or a function of having negotiated on a number of the topics over several board meetings now without coming to conclusion is hard to be seen, it's hard to know. But so far this year, at the 2 board meetings that have happened, as typically happens at board meetings, the board has approved a number of projects. They have accredited or re-accredited a number of entities, and at the most recent one, they've approved a number of policies. And that's sort of what happens at most board meetings. So just to highlight a few things, first from the first board meeting of this year, B31, they considered and approved 2 projects, which was a relatively low number, which has to do both with the review process for projects, but also relates to the amount of money that the GCF can commit. As a number of countries have pledged money in, there's also the amount of money they have on hand, which limits their ability to program money. And this will lead into a bit of the looking forward as we look towards the next replenishment, which I'll touch on a bit at the end. And at the board meeting before this last one, in addition to those 2 projects, they also focused quite a bit on some of the evaluations the independent evaluation unit has done, including not only looking at those evaluations, but looking at how the GCF responds to those evaluations and thinking through how the GCF should be responding to those evaluations and how the board should be holding the GCF then accountable for taking on board the suggestions and the recommendations in those evaluations to be better. And so in that context, they looked at, an evaluation on adaptation and on how the GCF is performing in small island developing states and with least developed countries, and wanted to focus a bit on how the Secretariat was going to respond to these. And they haven't necessarily come up with full solutions for those, but it was a interesting discussion that the board had. And one of the first times I think the board has really engaged in some of these evaluations and going forward as a way of improving the GCF, which is good. And at that meeting, they also accredited one new entity from Jamaica, and they re-accredited a number of entities, including with the most discussion involved re-accreditation of the Development Bank of South Africa due to parts of its portfolio still being invested in fossil fuels and wanting, and one of the things that one of the values or what the GCF is supposed to do is also to help entities and financiers shift their portfolios away from fossil fuels, which is in line with the goals of the Paris Agreement, which is in line with obviously providing, climate finance is both about providing the finance we need for mitigation and adaptation, at least in the context of the GCF, and loss and damage, which is a bit outside of the scope of what the GCF does. But it's also making sure we're not financing the wrong things. So financing, fossil fuels that are driving the climate crisis. And so part of what the GCF is supposed to do is that when it accredits entities, it has to re-accredit them every 5 years. And in the re-accreditation process, it's supposed to look at how that entity has shifted its portfolio away from fossil fuels. And so there was a long discussion at the first board meeting of this year about the Development Bank of South Africa and its commitments to not funding fossil fuels, commitments it was making towards net zero and to combating climate change, with ultimately the board acknowledging the steps it has taken and reaccrediting it. And I'm touching on that because similar issues came up at the most recent board meeting at B32. So at the most recent board meeting, as I mentioned, it's the first in-person board meeting we've had in a few years. And it's also important to note that this year begins a new term for GCF board members. So GCF board members every 3 years, I believe, there are new terms. And so now there are new members to the board, and people who have both been serving as board members for a long time, but also people who haven't been. And so there's a new group of people from countries to engage with, and who are engaging in some of these policies either again or for the first time or as board members for the first time, which also creates, different dynamics and new dynamics in the board. And it's important to note that at this moment on the board, it's an evenly divided board with 12 developed country seats and 12 developing country seats. But right now, while we have board members and within the developing countries, there are 3 seats from Africa, 3 from Asia Pacific, 3 from the Latin America Caribbean region, as well as 1 dedicated to least developed countries, 1 for small island developing states, and 1 that is a sort of floating seat makes up that constituency. And right now there are no board members currently from the Latin American Caribbean region because they haven't nominated who they will be. And so we're missing 3 board members plus their alternates, which is important to note, especially as decisions are being made on policies as well as on projects in the region, without the voices of anyone on the board from those regions. And so just to highlight that as an issue or as something to look at as you're engaging with or thinking about engaging with the GCF. So at this board meeting, again, they considered a fairly, for the GCF, low number of projects So they approved 3 funding proposals, as well as 1 funding proposal that came through a simplified approval process, which I'll describe a bit more. And then interestingly, they approved a second tranche or a second amount of funding for a project that they had approved several years ago. And when they had approved that project several years ago, they said, before we approve the next big chunk of money, we want to check in on this project that was about clean cook stoves in 2 countries in Africa. And so the accredited entity had to come back and say, here's what we've been doing, here's what we want for, and here's why we need the second amount of funding. And they approved all of those in a fairly straightforward manner. And unlike in some other years, most of, while there were some concerns, because one of the things that we do collectively within GCF Watch and across our network is look at all of these projects and reach out to people who are in countries and who might be impacted by them to get feedback and to present that feedback to the board. And for the most part, while we had a few concerns about some of these projects, there were no major concerns about these projects, which included a project in the Galapagos Islands, a large private sector financing facility in India for mobility, a small project in Vanuatu, a project in Pakistan about lending for solar, and then the second tranche of funding for another project. And so they were all of those projects were approved. And then there was a few more reaccreditations approved. Both Conservation International was reaccredited, and more controversially, the Korean Development Bank, which was opposed by, their reaccreditation was opposed largely by the CSO network. And there was a letter that went out. Calling on the GCF board not to reaccredit the Korean Development Bank because of its ongoing funding of fossil fuels, of coal, oil, and gas projects across Asia. And this letter was shared with board members, was shared widely on social media. And in their discussion of reaccrediting Korean Development Bank, the GCF, actually, one board member said, we've received this letter, how are we responding to it? Shouldn't we be responding to it? Which was interesting to note, because board members don't necessarily respond that way to civil society every time. And I wanted to highlight that because I think it demonstrates the importance and the impact that we are having collectively on the institution, and in making them pause and reflect on what they're doing. And there was again a discussion about whether KDB was shifting its portfolio, what its policies were around climate change, and ultimately the board decided to reaccredit it while acknowledging the commitments that the bank itself and the Korean government, of which the bank is a part, which the development bank is a part, have made towards being committed to achieving net zero by 2050 and what their climate policies are. And while as civil society, these words on paper aren't enough, the board sort of acknowledged them and looked at them. And I think this is an important thing to think about going forward as more entities come up for reaccreditation, including entities that are still investing heavily in fossil fuels, and thinking through, what as civil society we want to do to push the GCF to actually take more scrutiny, and not just sort of acknowledge that some of what these banks have done on paper is made vague commitments in the future, but what steps they're actually taking, and to look more critically at whether they're actually shifting their portfolios away. The other couple big things that happened at the last board meeting were approval of some policies that have long been being discussed. And one of the challenges we've seen over the last 2 years of virtual meetings due to the ongoing pandemic is that it's created a reluctance in the board to engage in some of these policy discussions and to approve policies, using sort of the virtual setting and saying it's too hard to discuss these critical policies in a virtual setting, and so we can't do it right now, we just have to wait. But as we know, the climate crisis isn't stopping, and we can't really wait for these policies to be in place that are designed to help the GCF do better. So at this meeting, we saw a number of policies come forward and get approved after several years. The first of which I'll talk about is a simplified approval process, as this is something that as collectively as civil society, as Indigenous peoples groups, as local communities, we've engaged quite a bit on, which is a process that the GCF has developed to make the ability to get funding simpler, particularly for smaller projects and projects that have no risk. And they had been doing a pilot for the simplified approval process, or the SAP as it's called. And there have been a little around 25, I think, SAP projects at this point that have been approved. But what they've seen is that it wasn't necessarily simpler. And so they wanted to update that process to make it simpler. And in doing so, we're considering whether or not that meant they should increase the category of risk that the project could be. So saying, maybe it can have minimal environmental and social risks rather than no environmental and social risks. They considered increasing the amount of funding that could be done through a SAP process so that funding amounts could be greater. They considered whether or not these projects should be approved, not just at board meetings, but through decisions in between board meetings where the board could approve these smaller projects on a no objection basis. At one point, they were considering whether they could delegate this authority to the GCF Secretariat itself rather than coming through the board, as well as in this most recent one, considering whether or not you could just assume there was a climate rationale for the project, which is an ongoing question for the GCF. And so as this debate has gone about, as a network, we've engaged quite a lot in sharing our views with board members and coming up with collective views, including that as civil society, we strongly support a simplified approval process, but with the caveat that who it should really be benefiting is direct access entities and smaller entities in countries who can benefit from a simplified approach, that it should still only be for small projects, and that they should be projects that are categorized as no risk projects or category C projects, because even projects that are identified as having minimal risks, we've often seen that those projects that fall into sort of limited or minimal risk category B projects actually carry way more risk to the environment and to people than is initially seen or is initially looked at. And as there's more risk, there's more scrutiny related to environmental and social safeguards and more paperwork that's needed. And it can't be truly simplified because you need to make sure that the projects aren't harming people in the environment. And we had also pushed back quite a bit on the notion that these projects should be approved in between meetings, because the ability of civil society to engage with and analyze projects and to present our concerns to the board, or our concerns or our praise for a project to the board, is severely limited when it's an in-between meeting decision, which is just sent out by email and is done on a no objection basis over a 20-day period. And so it's much harder to engage. And so this time around, they did finally approve the simplified approval process. And a number of things that I think were not clear at the beginning as parts that board members were going to hold the line on and that we were advocating for ended up coming to fruition, which I think speaks to the value of our collective advocacy. So they approved a new process. While they did up the amount so that projects can now be up to, I believe, $25 million, they still have to be no risk projects or category C. They're not going to presume climate rationale, which is a discussion I'll get to in a minute. And they're not going to do them as decisions between meetings, which would impact participation and transparency. And so now hopefully this will provide a simplified approach, but not come with the inherent risks that were initially feared. They also approved a private sector approach, as there's an increasing emphasis at the GCF Secretariat for wanting to engage the private sector, which if done correctly and focused on sort of local and micro and small and medium-sized enterprises in countries, could be quite useful. There's a fear or a concern, I would say, amongst our groups, amongst civil society generally, about what this means for transparency, that if it's really focusing on providing equity and funds of funds, how we're going to make sure the money is being spent in the right way, how people are going to know that projects are from the GCF and that they'll be able to engage, and what safeguards come across this. But the GCF is very much pushing for the private sector and more private sector to be involved as catalyzing a larger amount of finance. And then on some more technical things, they approved guidelines for board committees and who can be on board committees. What I will note about that is that there had been in their lines around rules around categorical exclusion of having observers, and we managed to mobilize a number of board members, and so that was taken out, and so there is not a categorical exclusion of observers. It doesn't mean we'll necessarily get to participate in these committees where they're increasingly discussing policies and issues, but it means we're not categorically excluded, which is important. They also put in language or striving more related to gender balance, which is part of the GCF's mandate. They also importantly, after many years, finally adopted guidelines for how the board will make decisions between meetings. And one of the important things there that was noted by a board member is that when making decisions between meetings, which are generally, the decisions are circulated or like sent out to board members as well as to the active observers, which we then share with the network on a no objection basis for a period of days that ranges from sort of 7 days to 21 days. And it's historically been quite hard for us as civil society to collectively share our views or to like come up with views, both because of the time period and transparency, but also not being able to sort of share them with the whole board because we don't have everyone's email address and we can't, we're not giving a statement at a board meeting. And so one of the things we wanted in these guidelines was a explicit recognition or a way to say our views will be shared with the board. And we didn't necessarily get that explicit recognition that had been in some of the drafts for these, but the board did clarify, and one of the board members made a statement clarifying that according to the rules of procedure, the Secretariat is supposed to circulate all comments it receives to board members, in which they think also includes comments from active observers, which means we have a commitment that if we're sharing comments on these decisions between meetings, those will be shared with board members, which is good because otherwise this whole between meeting process is much less transparent and much less participatory than an actual board meeting where we're allowed to deliver interventions collectively on behalf of civil society. So those are the highlights of what was approved at the last board meeting. And just quickly going forward as we look ahead to the rest of this year, there are a number of other issues that are important for civil society that will be coming up both at the next 2 board meetings, as there are supposed to be 2 more board meetings this year, but also that are happening in parallel to the board process. And so just to touch on a few of those, is that they're still discussing the GCF's approach to adaptation. And they discussed it a bit at this last meeting. And, you know, we have a shared intervention that we gave both, you know, a lengthy document we shared with board members as well as an intervention we gave, because the approach was really coming at it from a private sector adaptation angle, which seems not exactly right. Or too narrowly focused on how the private sector can get involved in adaptation. But so the adaptation approach is expected to come up at the next board meeting, which is important because, as we know, there's definitely not enough financing for adaptation, both from the GCF or collectively in the world. Closely related to that is that they've been working on a paper around climate rationale, as projects are supposed to say, like, here's the climate rationale, like why it's a climate finance project as opposed to just a development project, which has long been a debate, and what you look at related to climate rationale, and whether that's looking at IPCC reports, looking at Indigenous peoples and local communities' traditional knowledge, etc. And so that hasn't been shared yet, but is an important document that's coming up. They're developing an accreditation approach because the GCF now has over 100 accredited entities, but many of them haven't ever gotten financing for a project. And there's a question of whether or not, you know, there are enough direct access entities, enough private sector entities. And so the GCF has been, and the board has wanted to have an approach to accreditation, because it was a first come, first serve approach that they've been using. And there's a discussion about whether or not that needs to actually be more of a, okay, we're going to like prioritize these groups, and here's how we're going to approach accrediting entities, so that it's not just that the GCF has hundreds of accredited entities, but all of the projects are going to, you know, 30. Because that's not really serving the purpose. And so they're developing an accreditation approach that is expected to be consulted on with the board and with observers. They're sort of in parallel to board meetings. The GCF has been developing these sector guides for sectors, including, you know, forest and ecosystem services and energy efficiency. And they've released 2 more sector guides that are out for consultation and are going to be going forward. We will, of course, at the upcoming board meetings, see more projects. There will be more entities up for accreditation and for re-accreditation. And on the re-accreditation, I think, you know, obviously there's critical things to think about, both how, when entities coming up for re-accreditation that have had projects, how those projects are going. You know, have they caused harm? Are they complying with their environmental and social safeguards? Are they working with communities? How have they done stakeholder engagement? And I think that's one of the places where networks and things such as GCF Watch, where communities can be monitoring on the ground how implementation is going, and sort of saying, like, this is what this entity has been doing, so it should be re-accredited, or it shouldn't be, or if it's re-accredited, you need to put in place these conditions so that it meets them before it gets more GCF money, as well as a focus on whether or not, you know, some of the entities are still engaging in fossil fuel financing. So those will be coming up at future board meetings. The GCF is also finally going through the process of creating its own environmental and social safeguards, and it's done the first 2 phases of that, and should at some point this summer have out a draft, a sort of overall draft of what its environmental and social safeguards will look like. And that will be open for comments. And that's obviously a process that collectively as observers we've engaged in quite a bit. And so there will be opportunities to comment on those further before they're adopted by the board, either at the last board meeting of this year or at the first board meeting of next year, depending on how that process goes. There was discussion at this last board meeting about finally launching into the review of the guidelines for observer participation, which is obviously very important to all of us as observers. There was some discussion about launching it at this last meeting that included some concerning language about how we choose active observers, but ultimately it didn't happen. But that's on the radar or the back burner of what the co-chairs might do this year. And then importantly, one of the things that is launching and that I alluded to is that the GCF is going to have to start its process looking towards its second replenishment. So the GCF had an initial resource mobilization. It had a first replenishment in which it got an additional $10 billion, and it will be launching its second replenishment process. And countries will have to come at the end of 2023 to make new pledges and new financial commitments to the GCF. And that is a longer process that involves both that the independent evaluation unit is doing a performance review, the second performance review of the GCF, to see how they're going, which will then inform, excuse me, the replenishment process, as well as the updated strategic plan that the GCF wants to put in place, an updated strategic plan to go along with the second replenishment process. And this is all going to have to be launched by the next board meeting. They've acknowledged that this process should be open and participatory, and that it should include observers and the board, and not just countries that are going to give money to the GCF, but that it really needs to be driven by a much broader process. And so that's going to be an important thing that happens over the next year and a half for shaping the direction of the GCF, and an important role for collectively civil society to play, because the GCF really should be serving what people need. And it's a country-driven process, and country-driven isn't government-driven, but really should be driven by people in countries who are most impacted by the climate crisis itself. And so those are a few things to look forward to in the coming year. And just to note that the next board meeting will take place in mid-July, from July 17th to 20th. And then the one after that will be later in the fall. But I think that's really where we are, and what happened at B32, and a few things to look forward to over the coming year. And I'm happy to answer any questions. And back to you, Florencia.
Thank you, Erica. That was such a complete panorama of what's going on. And it also allows us to sort of reflect on what goes on with climate finance in general, and the importance of the role of civil society organization, which is what people are doing there at the board level, at the international level, what people are doing in the countries where the implementation of projects is happening, and how everyone connects. So all this information that you bring to us is just so important. It allows us to do our work, to sort of take the opportunity of including this information in whatever we are doing, because in the end, everything is connected, and climate finance is definitely such an important part of our quest towards solving this climate crisis. So thank you, Erica. I would be commenting on this for a very long time. We have a couple of questions, but before that, I'm going to go into our very interesting experiment, which I'm looking forward to. I've never done this before, so bear with me. I will now open the survey, and the idea is that you can let us know which topics you would like to see covered in our third session. So what topic around the GCF is more interesting to you or your organization? And you can tick more than one, hopefully no more than 3. So after the first question, which has 10 options, which you can tick, I will ask you to include in the chat of the Zoom any other topics that weren't in the options that you would like to see covered. And with that, we will design this third session. So now I'm going to initiate the poll. Apparently it's working. And I'm going to give you a little bit of time to answer. I can see there how many people have answered. Okay, somebody is asking a very fair question. What is NDA? The NDA is the National Designated Authority, which is the person or office in the countries that receive funding from the GCF, that has the role of connecting what happens in the GCF at the international level with what happens at the local level. So interacting with your NDA is going to the person in your government that is communicating with the GCF. So it's a very interesting way of engaging with the GCF at the country level. Okay, so we're going to read that because there's no translation in Portuguese. So our interpreter in Portuguese is going to read them aloud in Portuguese for anyone who needs that help. So yes, thank you for our interpreter. And there's no in French either. So yes, we can do that now, please. Okay, so 75% of people have answered. I'm going to give it 1 or 2 minutes more, and then we can have a short round of questions. Okay, I'm gonna end the poll now. So if anybody is about to click, do it now. We've got more than most people have answered already. It's interesting because I can see the answers. It's quite balanced. So the topic about the NDA is the one most voted, but then all the rest have more or less the same percentage of interest. So we'll see how we get that, how we choose. We might have to do more webinars. Okay, so I'm going to finish it now. Thank you to everyone who voted, and thanks to our interpreters as well. Okay, so now I'm going to go for some questions. We don't have a lot of time, but I think we can cover most of the ones that have been put in the box. The first one is for Cairos, and it's asking, it says, excellent explanation of the GCF Watch. My question is about South America. How many cases of observations have you received? And in the case of Bolivia, which would be, which civil society representatives or indigenous peoples or organizations have contacted you? So maybe, Cairos, you can tell us if there's been any interaction with Bolivia, with the GCF Watch. And if not, I'm sure we can definitely invite them to participate and to get connected.
Yeah, to be honest and frank about it, I mean, it's the process of generating stories, of curating content from the ground. I mean, it remains to be an aspiration in the general sense, right? I mean, it's a work in progress, but I think it's good that you attended this webinar because Florencia is the Latin American regional node. So if you have anything that you want to share, I mean, this would be an opportune moment that we should seize, because then, we'll have something to show for afterwards. Yeah, in terms of the actual numbers of observations, in terms of comments, I think there are quite a lot in the GCF Watch, especially if the agenda is part of the GCF board meeting agenda item, because the observer network, especially our active observers, Erica and Eileen and the rest of the observer team, I mean, all of them are doing a splendid job in ensuring that there are comments, interventions on critical items in Latin America and in most developing countries. So yeah, I mean, go to the GCF Watch website. There's a special section specifically on comments and interventions by civil society, and there's a lot of work already on that end. So thank you for the question.
Thank you, Kairos. And yes, for the person that asked that, well, you're going to receive the recordings from this webinar, but please write to me. I'm the regional node for Latin America, so I'm there to connect people in the region to the GCF and to all the work we're doing. So, well, for Erica, there's two questions. One is, how are the challenges around repressive governments addressed? I guess this means, for example, how do we do it when there are proposals for countries where we know that there is no legitimate participation of civil society? Maybe share and if there's been any example of that, or if there's any like political way of addressing this issue. And the other one has to do with what you mentioned about the seats in Latin America being vacant, especially now that we have the Escazú agreement, which is all about participation and transparency. Well, I know this is like a very political issue that has not very much to do with the GCF. It actually has to do with processes up in the UN. But maybe, Erika, if you have any information of how that's going, that would be appreciated by our attendees.
I will try my best. So on the first question, I guess there are a number of ways that challenges are addressed or not addressed, because the GCF is open to countries, like all countries, really, who are party to the UNFCCC, can receive the money, or all non-Annex 1 countries. There are a number of policies that are in place to address certain things, like there's an anti-money laundering and counter-financing of terrorism policy, and there are policies in place, and there have been long discussions, particularly around supply chain issues, or around issues around human trafficking, where board members have not been in the position to approve projects. There's a voting process for projects when they come up, in case there are challenges, or board members are not in a position to approve projects. I mean, I will say it's a challenge, right? Because obviously, there are a number of repressive governments out there, especially that are repressive of civil society engagement, and where there's shrinking civil society space. And I wouldn't say that those projects are excluded, but in order to access GCF money, projects do have to be both signed off by the NDA, the National Designated Authority. They have to be, they're developed through concept notes and through working with the Secretariat, through accredited entities. So there have to be entities that are willing to work with those governments and in those spaces. And then they have to comply with all of the policies, both fiduciary policies, and policies on, like, anti-money laundering, countering the financing of terrorism, et cetera, as well as the environmental and social policies, including, basic standards related to public participation, related to human rights, related to respecting the rights of Indigenous peoples, et cetera. And so there are policies in place. Those aren't, obviously a silver bullet, but can help try and address some of those challenges. As for sort of the challenges related to Latin America and Escazú and the lack of board members, I mean, one, I'll say, as Valencia mentioned, whether and when those board members will be seated is a much higher political question, and is way above the pay grade of anyone on this call, and is a sort of broader UN question. And we certainly hope that there are board members soon. But I do think that it is very important, and I think that one of the things that's important as civil society actors and going forward is to really highlight things like the Escazú Agreement, right? Like, countries have ratified the Escazú Agreement, which requires and demands that there's space for participation of civil society, of Indigenous peoples, has in language about environment and human rights defenders, has in language about access to information and justice and participation. And that it's important for the GCF, as it's going forward and as it's funding projects, that when it's developing its policies, such as its safeguard policies, when it's approving projects in those countries and elsewhere, is looking at and saying, do these projects, has the steps that have been taken to, you know, consult with stakeholders, when they've done their stakeholder participation, when they've developed these projects, have they done it in compliance with the country's, with what the country has to do under ESCAZU, because it's ratified the ESCAZU agreement, right? And so making sure that we're bringing in the human rights norms and other policies and agreements that governments have acceded to and adhered to say these are important in the context of climate finance and these need to be considered and can't just be ignored when it comes to climate finance. And so if you're not complying with the ESCAZU, if in developing a project in, you know, a country in Latin America that has ratified the ESCAZU agreement, there hasn't been robust consultation with civil society, or there hasn't been, you know, a process to obtain the free, prior, and informed consent of Indigenous peoples that may be impacted, that's not a project the GCF should be funding, or that before they fund any of that project, those steps need to be taken. And so I think thinking about ways to bring those things into the GCF and remind GCF board members about this is really important. And hopefully that answers the question somewhat.
I think it does. They were very complicated questions, actually, very interesting as well. So thank you, Erica, for taking the shot. Well, there's not much time left. I would like to just pass the message that as regional node for Latin America, I am always building on a database of people, communities and organizations, experts, etc., from the region that are interested in following up on the GCF. And obviously this is done also by my colleagues who are the regional nodes for Asia and for Africa. So I invite you to reach out. You can reach out to me and I can put you in contact with the regional nodes from the other regions. You can also find them very easily in the GCF Watch webpage. I invite you to connect if you want to be informed of any projects and programs that are going to be implemented in your region. This is like a very important thing for us because there might be not many projects per country every year, but when there's one, it is really important for us to be able to sort of share the information very quickly with people that are experts in the issues around the projects, that are local to where the project is going to be implemented, that are organizations that know the place, etc. So that is like a very, very important part of what we do as civil society organizations working with the GCF. So here we are sort of doing that bridge with local communities, passing the information to the organizations such as Erica's organizations who are working more at the international level. And that's how we sort of link and work together. So I invite you to connect. We'll send you the recordings and my email will be there. And that's it. Thank you very much. The poll was a success. And we'll see you in our next session, which is the 7th of July. Thank you very much to our panelists and to all our attendees and to our help here in the behind the scenes that happened today. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.